Boop. Happy Monday. Welcome to Monday, May 4th, 2020. Today's daily Bible readings were Psalm 100, Ezekiel 34, 17 through 23, and then 1 Peter 5, 1 through 5. But I'm really going to focus on Ezekiel, and maybe a brief mention at the end of 1 Peter. So today's passage from Ezekiel is part of a larger rant in Ezekiel against shepherds and sheep. The part before this in chapter 34 is going on against the bad job that the shepherds of God's people have done, and now God turns his attention to the sheep or sheeple themselves, specifically the really fancy sheeple. And so it starts off, and it's basically a word against the sheep. And he says, it isn't enough for you to have yours, basically, is what he's saying. You have to ruin it for others in the process of getting what I've provided for you. And the idea was really that God has provided all these great things for his people, for his sheeple. And there are some sheep among the flock that in the midst of getting what they need or getting what they want, they kind of ruin it for everybody else. And he says, it's not enough for you to just go and eat the grass of the pasture. You have to trample it, the rest of it, everybody else's pasture, underfoot, so that when they get there, it's no good. It's not enough for you to go and drink water. You have to muddy the water for everybody else in the process. In other words, you don't just drink from the spring. You get in there and you churn it up so that when the other sheep come behind you, they can't drink it, or if they want to drink, they got to drink all this muddy water. And what he's pointing out is the imagery is just this greedy pursuit of your own comfort at the expense of others, right? It's not just that you get the provisions that God's provided for you so that you can make it through that day, so that your hunger is satisfied and your thirst is slaked. That's an old-fashioned word, slaked. Nobody really talks about slaking their thirst anymore. You have to make sure that nobody else gets what they want either, and it's it's either knowingly or unknowingly, but you're so greedy to get what you want and what you need that you kind of make sure that nobody else can get what they want or what they just basically need. And he talks about the fat and the lean, and he says that I myself shall judge between the fat sheep and the thin sheep, which is what the New Jerusalem translation says. The other ones all say, most of the other translations that I've seen say lean sheep, but New Jerusalem it says the thin sheep. That's different than being lean, right? I know people that are pretty lean, but they're not thin. And so thin implies that these sheep are not getting enough. Somewhere along the line, things are falling apart, and they are not getting just the basics that they need. And he says, with flank and shoulder, you have pushed them aside. You've butted them with your horns, and with flank and shoulder, you've pushed them aside. So they have these sheep that are, already strong. They're fat. They're living high off the land, and they're using that and not only just ruining what is left for everybody else, but actually shoving them out of the way so that they can get more. Reading this today made me think of a text from John Wesley called "The Present Scarcity of Provisions." I'm double checking that. Yeah, the present scarcity of provisions. He wrote this in 1773, I think. Let me double check my notes. Yeah, 1773, January of 73. And he talks about at the beginning of it how he has witnessed in his travels throughout Great Britain. And keep in mind that he has been an at-home missionary to his own country of England since the 1740s, really. And he has been traveling all over the country, organizing the people, preaching to the people, making sure that the poor were taken care of, that the hungry were fed, the people who needed clothing had clothing, that children were being educated, that the sick were being taken care of, that prisoners were being visited in prison. And in the course of all these travels, over 30 plus years, he has witnessed people picking food from the trash to feed so they can feed themselves and their children. People picking bones up out of the street that he says were left behind by dogs, but nonetheless picking up bones out of the street so that they could boil them and make just a broth for themselves, right? And they're doing this because they couldn't afford to buy food. Part of the reason he says that they couldn't afford to buy food is because there were no real jobs to be had. And even if they had jobs, they wouldn't be able to afford food because everything had become so expensive. And he says, meanwhile, later on, and this is part of how he points to why even food is so expensive, so that even if you had a job, you couldn't afford to buy it. He says, if a person of quality, and that's his nice word for people that are well off, very wealthy people. He says, if a person of quality will boil down 3 dozen of neat's tongues, neat's an old-fashioned word for cows, right? So if a person of quality will boil down 3 dozen of neat's tongues to make 2 or 3 quarts of soup, what wonder that provisions fail. What he's pointing to is a sign of luxury. It's not just enough that they make they eat some soup or make themselves, but they have to have the best soup, the most delicious soup. They have to have this, it's not just enough to get a beef tongue and boil it down. If you've never tried tongue, by the way, go to a really good Mexican restaurant that serves taco lengua. It's pretty awesome. And so anyway, the idea is that they're not just making enough soup for them. They're taking the quantity, which, do the math, what 3 dozen tongues are and how many cows, because cows don't give up their tongues willingly. You kind of got to kill them first. They're taking enough food for dozens and dozens and dozens of people and rendering it down so they can have this really, really fancy soup to impress themselves and their friends, supposedly. So that's like a very distinct dichotomy between somebody who's picking up bones out of the street just to boil some broth and somebody who is taking the provisions that could have fed dozens and dozens of people and just making a quart of soup or a couple of quarts of soup out of it. It makes me think of towns, not just this town, but towns across the country, and we're having these online petitions to bring Trader Joe's in, this fancy supermarket that, is only in a few towns. And Trader Joe's has an incredibly smart business model because they don't just open up anywhere. Like, people drive hours to go to a Trader Joe's, right? And so people start online petitions to bring Trader Joe's to their town, right? And meanwhile, you have food deserts in those towns where supermarkets won't set up because they don't, the demographics not quite right for them and they can't make any money off of it. So you have people that literally cannot just walk to a grocery store or quickly get to a grocery store to get the basic provisions they need. And I point to myself there because if there were a Trader Joe's here in Chattanooga, I would probably go to it and I would probably buy something and I would probably think it was really, really good. But there's a difference between, this kind of luxury of having the best of something and merely having what you need to get by that day, and then the cost of that luxury for your neighbor. So we've gone from this idea of like, oh, we got to start an online petition to get Trader Joe's to open up here in town, to now in these days we're wondering if we'll be able to go to the neighborhood Walmart and whether or not they'll have actually any meat on the shelves at all that day, right? Because the supply chain is wavering under the stress of these times. And a lot of us who would really like something fancy from Trader Joe's are finding out that we're not too proud to eat Spam. Although, realistically speaking, it's not even that bad yet for the great majority of us. So, what does this mean? Does it mean an end to luxury in these times? Are we going to go from making sure what would that look like? It would mean making sure that we have enough without trampling the pasture for everyone else. It would mean relieving our own thirst and making sure others can still drink after us, right? The question Wesley asks at the end of this little essay on the scarcity of provisions is, he says, "But will this ever be done?" And he says, "I fear not." And then he ends with this. He says, "It seems as if God must shortly arise and maintain his own cause. But if so, let us fall into the hands of God and not into the hands of men." And that's once again John Wesley writing in 1773. And so he says God's going to have to stand up and see to God's own cause, because he doesn't have a lot of faith that that his world, his society, his culture, his government is going to see to the things that God is concerned about. And so what is God's cause? Well, his cause is justice. And as Ezekiel says, justice means judging between the sheep. Sorry to break it to you. Spoiler alert. That means that we all need a shepherd. And like for that, you need a shepherd. And that's actually what he says. He says, "I will set up over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he shall feed them. He shall feed them and be their shepherd." Who is this shepherd is the question. And that's actually where we get to with 1 Peter, which is the reading today, which I'll let you read, but I'll give you a little taste of it. And it says, Peter says to the followers, he says, "And when the chief shepherd appears," and it's a warning that Peter is giving to the believers that you need to do your work and you need to live out your lives as Christian in a way so that when the chief shepherd appears, you will be happy because you've done the kind of work that he was going to do. So, well, fancy sheeple, we're all kind of fancy sheeple, if we, whether or not we like to admit it. But go out and live your day. Get what you need. Get your grass from the pasture and your water from the spring, and make sure that you've left something behind for everyone else. Have a good day. We'll see you tomorrow. Boop.